Hey everyone, my name is James and welcome back to ChippyGaming. So in January of 2011, aspiring programmer Andrew Spinks sat down and for the very first time began working on a project the world would later know as Terraria. Or Terraria if you're Andrew. It's now January 2021, which now means it's been 10 years since Terraria began development. To celebrate this, I wanted to give you a complete playthrough of Terraria's beta, which I estimate to be from late March 2011. This has never been shown in its entirety here on YouTube, and it's really awesome to look at. Before we get into the gameplay though, I do want to give a quick history on this version of Terraria and how it actually affected the game's launch. But before we get into it, if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to give the video a big fat thumbs up, and why not subscribe to ChippyGaming? We're trying to hit 1 million subscribers this year. It's never been done by a Terraria channel, and with your help, I feel like we can do it. Alright, let's talk about the history. So like I mentioned at the start, Terraria began development in January of 2011 and was released only 5 months later on May 16th, 2011. What you may know is that Terraria wasn't actually meant to release in May. It was meant to have a lot more work put into it, but because 2 separate versions of Terraria was actually leaked, once the distribution deal was settled with Steam, the game was released early in the May of that year. It's hard to find accurate information on what went down during all of this, so take everything I say with a pinch of salt. But for those wondering what the 2 different versions were, the first one is referred to as Terraria's Alpha, and this was actually leaked a little bit earlier than the beta. In this version of the game, you could run the game, you could play, but you wouldn't be able to save. There was only a couple of items in the game and everything looked completely different. When this first version was initially leaked, the responses were pretty good. By this point, people had already seen the Terraria reveal trailer and the game looked a lot different than this early alpha build, so people just assumed that this was just a mock-up version from way before they found out about the game. The second version, however, was met with a lot of skepticism. You see, when Terraria was originally being developed, all of the sprites that were shown during the reveal trailer were placeholder sprites actually inspired by Final Fantasy. So what Relogic did during this time is they announced the game and revealed it, but then they hired the artist Finn Bryce to go over all of those assets and replace them with the ones that we know in Terraria's first release. So it seems like this beta build of Terraria was actually leaked a week before the game was first sold on Steam and was circulated using the website 4chan. The issue is, because this build was 2 months old at this point and still featured all of those Final Fantasy sprites and an incomplete boss roster, it seems like the reception to this was pretty bad. And the issue is, people were then pirating and downloading the game that Relogic intended to sell only a couple of days later. All of this unfortunately forced the developer's hand, and they put the game up for sale on May 16th, 2011 with the version 1.0, but this isn't what they imagined for Terraria. So I've always wondered how these versions of Terraria were originally leaked. I assumed that it would be from some kind of disgruntled beta tester, but it turns out what might have happened is that people discovered that Red was hosting all of the Terraria files they needed to download on the official Terraria website. From what I've read from various forum posts from around this time, it seems like one sole person was able to download Terraria, let the developers know that their game was able to be downloaded, so that was cut off, but then they actually circulated that beta version using 4chan. The thing I really love about this story is that this event could have ruined Terraria, but the developers were actually dedicated to making Terraria what they wanted it to be. Despite releasing early, they still worked on it for the following months and got it up to the 1.1 update, which I've always assumed to be the point where the developers were just more than happy to hand off the game. For those that don't know, when Terraria was released, it sold over 200,000 copies in its first week on Steam and nearly 500,000 in the first month. It would have been too easy to cash in and step away, but Relogic have never been about that, and I've always respected it. Unfortunately, this version of Terraria and every older version of Terraria I've shown on this channel are not available to download, and I can't share them with you. The reason why these are in my possession is because when I was younger, I wanted to preserve these versions of Terraria so that many years down the line, Terraria historians can have a little glimpse into the game's history. So I'm really glad I did that. I also want to say thank you to Relogic for being so cool when I show these old versions of Terraria, and thank you so much for 10 years. But with the history out the way, let's have a little look at the Terraria beta from late March 2011. So, my adventure began like any other by creating a character, and you can already tell things look a little bit different here. We're using sprites that are inspired by Final Fantasy, so it kind of looks like the player only has one leg. At this point, you only had 3 different hairstyles to choose from, and the misc option would actually change the colour of your shoes and also the colour of your belt. In modern Terraria, players don't have belts, alright? They just have really tight-fitting jeans. What's also interesting is that on the world creation screen, it shows you exactly how many megabytes it takes for a small, a medium, and a large world. So the world looks fairly similar to how it does in version 1.0. The guide actually looks the same as well. However, he's missing a few frames of his animation, so when he walks, it looks a little bit choppier. The game was also missing a lot of different sound effects, so you can see that every single thing that I mine in this video actually has the same sound effect. Like I still do to this day, the very first thing that I tried to do was set up a house and also get a bow and arrow. But what's different is that I'm able to craft the wooden bow. However, at this point, I'm not able to craft any arrows. It was intended in this stage of development that you would simply buy them from the merchant. So going back to those sound effects, you can see that even as I mine this iron ore, it sounds like a modern Terraria player actually digging up some dirt. One thing I really loved seeing, and this happened to me all throughout my adventure, is that the player wasn't able to suck up items quite nearly as fast as they are today. So items would often just kind of spill away from the character and get stuck underground because the player couldn't absorb them quickly enough. One of the things that I liked is that the very first cave system that I found actually looks a lot like a cave system you would find in modern Terraria. I think that's really cool how the foundations were there right at the very start of development. So one thing that was really interesting is that in this build of the game, mana didn't exist yet. There were no fallen stars, there was no mana to be gained. But what's interesting is that every now and again, I would kill a slime or an enemy, and the game would actually try and heal my mana. I also managed to get some arrows from these pots. So it doesn't really matter what version of Terraria I'm playing, some things just never changed. I realized that when looking at this footage, I actually missed the very first life crystal. Not to worry though, a couple of moments later, I found a new life crystal, and this is where I had my first pretty big discovery. So people that may have watched my 1.0 video will know that to get a life crystal, you needed to use a wooden hammer. In modern Terraria, you just use a pickaxe. However, the wooden hammer actually didn't exist at this point in Terraria's development. So it turned out that what you had to do was to craft a silver hammer and then actually get that life crystal. And it's interesting because I went back and watched the very first reveal trailer for Terraria, and you can see the player doing this with a silver hammer as well. So with a little bit of health, I encountered my first skeleton. It seemed like these were a little bit faster than what we got in the first release of Terraria. However, I'm not too sure if that was maybe just me in a panic. But what's cool is that he actually dropped a hook that I would later turn into a grapple hook. But because the player doesn't say the item above its head, it's funny, I didn't really notice it until like an hour afterwards that I'd gotten it. So not too long into my adventure, I got my very first chest just out in the open. And it's funny because in that 1.0 video I made last year, I said that I kind of missed these a little bit. And then we actually got them in Terraria 1.4. I also managed to find a blue mushroom biome. And just like when I was a kid, I get so excited about these. It doesn't matter what version of Terraria I'm playing, when you drop down and you get this new sense of discovery, it's really addictive, and it's one of my favorite parts about Terraria. So since my player's inventory was very quickly getting filled up, I decided to head back home and start working on my NPC tower. Building a house is the exact same as it is in the first release of Terraria, but this part's a little bit different. I was very quickly greeted by the merchant, and he looks a little different. So from what I've read, this version of the merchant was actually directly inspired by a character from Final Fantasy V. This was of course before they hired an artist to replace all of the sprites that were inspired by Final Fantasy. But what's cool is that he's selling all of the same items that he sold in the full release. So now that I had a merchant, I really wanted to check some of the gems that I found while mining. I knew at this point gems didn't have any use, so I figured that they were probably used right at the very start to try and earn the player some money. So it turns out that gems sell for quite a lot, and it meant that by only selling a couple of them, even though they weren't rare, my character was minted, meaning that I could buy pretty much any item that I wanted to check out, but I decided what I would do is actually buy a bunch of arrows, since I wasn't able to craft them. I also used this time to smelt up a bunch of the ores that I'd found in the world, and I now had enough materials to make a pair of silver greaves. The sprite for this is so funny. It's like actually a silver pair of trousers. Like, I actually kind of love it in a weird way. Later that night, I actually discovered the dungeon for the first time. And although this dungeon looks amazing just like it does in the full release, what's different is the old man. Now, I've actually never seen this before. I had no idea that there was a placeholder sprite for the old man. You can tell that he's just a merchant with white hair, but you can see that with the white hair, the white beard, and the red coat, that's where the clothier was inspired from. So I was so amazed by this, I actually drowned right next to him. So I got my first Terraria death stood next to the original old man, and that felt very appropriate. After that, I did some more caving and discovered my first accessory. So the accessory that I got was actually the Hermes boots. Now, I was pretty interested in this because I assumed that at this point, all of the accessories may have different sprites because of the fact that we got from Red that the original Cloud in the Bottle was going to look like the angel statue. But no, this looks like Hermes boots. With the iron I found in the chest, I was then able to make a grappling hook. Now, this functions very similar to how it does in the full release. You have to manually throw it out rather than having a shortcut on your keyboard. That was introduced later on. But what I didn't know is that the grappling hook was actually intended as a weapon. So I realized this when kind of flying through the world that I could damage a zombie. It became obvious pretty quickly though why they removed this, because essentially you would try and use your grappling hook to get out of a bad situation, but instead you'd hit the enemy you were running away from and you just die of fall damage. It was like actually a bit of a nightmare. With the idea of bosses in mind, I decided it was time to check out the corruption. My goal here was to get some rotten chunks and some bile powder so that I could manually spawn in the Eater of Worlds. My intention was that the Eye of Cthulhu may take too long to spawn in, so by doing the Eater of Worlds I could get the Dryad, I could get the Shadow Orbs, and it would make everything a little bit easier. But a big problem actually arose shortly after this, because I soon realized that this world didn't have demon altars, and no other world that I checked had them either. So this meant it was actually impossible to spawn in the Eater of Worlds. Now, a clear plan is you would wait around for the Eye of Cthulhu, and then what you would do is you would use the Dryad to sell you some powder, and then you would do the Shadow Orbs and spawn the Eater of Worlds in that way. Turned out that the Eye of Cthulhu won't actually spawn in either. This version of Terraria, which I didn't know, is actually locked so that you won't do the boss fights, which we'll soon learn about Skeletron. One question I did have going into this, because I realized pretty quickly that this version doesn't have mana, is how does the water bolt work, and also how does it look? So I returned to the dungeon once more in a pursuit to get one. Unfortunately, I didn't find one, so I moved on to my next question, which was, does this version of Terraria have the jump scare, and how does that work? And it turns out that, yeah, it does. It has the jump scare with an instant death. But we come back here later, and there's actually a way to cheat it. So for this video, I ended up exploring 5 different worlds in pursuit of a demon altar. And this shadow orb right here was the only one that I could find that was glitched. So by destroying this shadow orb, what it allowed the world to do is to spawn in a meteorite and also give us the arm stealer, which was absolutely great for me because I did want to see what does the arm stealer look like and how does meteorite even work. Shortly after that, the nurse ended up moving into my NPC village, and it was really cool to see that the nurse actually looks identical to how she does today. Like the guide though, she's missing a few frames of animation, so she walks around a little differently. Shortly after that, we got the arrival of the arm stealer. We're going to be checking him out in a little bit. and I was also able to find the Meteorite. What's interesting is that the Meteorite actually works a lot like it does today. If a player steps on it without an obsidian skull, they do burn, and meteorite heads spawn around it. The meteorite heads look and act a little bit differently than they do today. They seem a little bit more aggressive and also a little bit more bouncy. But I'm going to be coming back to this later on to try and see if we can figure out a way to mine it. At this point, with the realization that I can't summon in the Eater of Worlds and I don't meet the criteria for the Eye of Cthulhu, or the criteria that I know to be in the full release, I decided what I would do is I would use a little bit of my talents with modern Terraria and just simply take out Skeletron. Now, taking out Skeletron is not too hard in this version. Obviously, it's very much like the same fight that we have now. It's a little bit more floaty though. However, there's a very big problem. His defense is so high that you can only deal 1 damage every single time you hit the boss. Now, my theory is that this was actually done so that the testers at the time wouldn't go into the dungeon. Maybe the dungeon wasn't complete yet. It looks a little incomplete when we go there later on. But I realized very quickly that we would not be taking down Skeletron. But I did have an idea in mind. So what I decided to do was actually bail on the fight and go back home and actually speak to our new arms dealer. So immediately you can see that the arms dealer looks a little different than how he does today. But what I did like is that the first dialogue option he gave me was about the nurse. So he's like the nurse since day one, alright? His pylon makes complete sense. So what I decided to do was use some of the money that I'd got from the gems and purchase a mini shark. This is probably the best weapon in Terraria at this point in the game. So I decided that if I had the mini shark and thousands and thousands and thousands of bullets, with the amount of time that you have to do the fight, I should be able to take down Skeletron. So I went to work at buying just thousands of bullets. So going into the second fight, I felt pretty confident that I was going to be able to do this, especially with the fact that I knew I wasn't going to die to the fight and I had enough bullets. I knew that as long as I was accurate enough, I should be able to take down its 3,000 health. That's not the case at all. What actually ended up happening is it turned daytime, and it seems like in this version of Terraria, daytime Skeletron will still instantly kill you. Now, if you've ever wondered what the original silver chest piece looks like, wonder no more, because this is what it looks like. I love these classic sprites. So with the idea of meeting the Eye of Cthulhu criteria in mind, I decided to go exploring again, and I actually did this on a new world, and I immediately found an accessory which I wasn't really hoping to find. So I ended up finding the cloud in a bottle, but what I was really hoping is that what we would actually find is the angel statue cloud in a bottle. Like I mentioned earlier, Red did say that the angel statue was originally going to be the cloud in a bottle, so I had my fingers crossed that in this version, we might actually find it. After that, I also realized that you can mine obsidian in this version with whatever pickaxe you have. You can also place blocks on lava and it completely deletes it from the world, which is cool. And then shortly after that, I unlocked a memory in my brain I forgot that I'd even had, which is these prototype fire imps that were shown in the original Terraria reveal trailer back in April 2011. So not only do they look different, their attacks also work different too. So they fire the same fireballs that they do normally at you, but you can actually repel them and they'll bounce away, kind of like an enemy in Mario. They also have a really high defense and take a long time to kill. And what's even better is they will die in lava, which obviously makes no sense and doesn't happen anymore. So I managed to work my way into hell, and I was pretty excited about this because I really wanted to check out what molten armor looked at this stage in development. However, it never really panned out that way. So I found out that you can mine hellstone using any pickaxe available to you, and it doesn't drop lava when broken, which it used to do in the full release. I did find though that you can make an obsidian skull. That was pretty interesting. I wouldn't have figured that that would be in this version of the game. However, I wasn't able to find a way to melt the hellstone. Now, modern Terraria, you would use a hellforge, but in this version of the game, they didn't seem to generate. So I ended up using my grappling hook and I scoured the whole of hell looking for one of these furnaces, but unfortunately they never popped up and I wasn't able to make it using a regular furnace. So I think at this point, this was just a part of the game that simply wasn't finished yet. So after fully exploring Hell, I decided I would head back home and start working on some more homes for my NPCs. I wanted to see if there was maybe the slim chance that we would get an NPC that nobody has ever seen before, maybe one that was cut from the game. And it turns out, yeah, I did get a new NPC, one that you really wouldn't expect. It was the guide, that's right. You hate the guide? Don't worry about it. Classic Terraria can give you 2 of them. Yeah, this was just a glitch, but oh my god, did it crack me up. So now that I had the obsidian skull, I decided, hey, I'll go and check out the meteorite. At this point, I'd also made a golden pickaxe, and it turns out that I can now mine the meteorite. I will say, trying to mine this meteorite with the original meteor heads is pretty annoying, but I found that I could get a good little balance by just flicking backwards and forwards. What's also interesting is that meteorite will not actually work with bombs. And I find this interesting as well because they changed this in Terraria 1.4. So it almost seems like, weirdly, Terraria is falling into its original fate. But yeah, I grabbed a bunch of meteorite because I was pretty excited to see what meteorite armor would look like at this point in development. How would a space gun work with no mana? Well, it turns out none of that was yet to be introduced. So I was able to actually craft up the meteorite bars. However, what you could make was mind-blowing. You could make the Molten Fury. So this is the Hellbow that we all know and love, the one that converts arrows into flaming arrows. So it seems like because the Hellstone wasn't completed in this build, this weapon was assigned to Meteorite, maybe for testing purposes. But hey, it actually works. I got a bunch of arrows, I tried it out, and look at that. Flaming arrows. Well done. So, with my new cloud in a bottle, I decided I would try Skeletron one final time. Since I was able to dodge a lot more of its attacks, it meant I could spend less time healing and more time working on the fight. However, with only 389 health remaining, I was swiped out of the sky. I really do feel like this was intentionally made to be impossible. So what I decided to do at this point was to wait around for the Eye of Cthulhu. I left my Terraria recording for 5 hours with an alarm set every 24 minutes so that what I could do is show up at the start of every night and see if the Eye of Cthulhu had spawned in. Unfortunately not, but one night I got a little bit bored and I headed to the dungeon. I noticed that the old man was no longer there, so I thought, oh, maybe I'm safe, maybe the game thinks I killed Skeletron. Not really, but this still technically worked, and we could see what the dungeon looked like at this stage of development. However, I do feel like it was intentional that the testers were not meant to come to this part of the game. So after 5 hours of waiting around, I realized that the Eye of Cthulhu was never going to spawn. I feel like boss fights were just maybe not done at this point. So I wanted to confirm that, so I ended up using Cheat Engine. Now, players would use this back in the day to speed up time. I was never one of those players, so this was my first time actually experiencing it. And what I did here is I left the game running for an hour, so I ended up getting to see about, I don't know, 100 to 200 different night cycles. But unfortunately, no Eye of Cthulhu was seen. I would have really loved to see the Dryad, but I did manage to go into the game files and actually have a little look at what she would have looked like. She also looks a little bit different, but it's cool to see that she has her signature green hair still. One of the things I wanted to do after this is get a nice little picture in the dungeon. So I made a new world, checked out the dungeon, and I actually managed to find at the top of it a water bolt. Now you can see that this looks immediately different to what we have today. And unfortunately, because there's no mana, we were not able to see what the projectiles were. However, with that, it felt like I'd tested everything that I'd wanted to test, so I thought that that would be the end of my Terraria beta adventure. So that about does it for today's video. Guys, thank you so much if you made it to the end. This was a hell of a lot of fun to record and to learn about. Terraria has the most interesting history to me, and I can't believe that it's been 10 years since this game began development. This game's been such a large part of my life for the past 10 years, and I imagine for a lot of you, it's the exact same thing. So, we'll meet up in 10 more years, and I'll see you when I'm 33. Alright, have a great day everyone. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.